My name's Rebecca Shapley. I'm a user experience researcher or something like that. We're still figuring out what our name is these days here at Google. I'm delighted to present today Dr. Cornelia Brunner. Cornelia has entertained and informed me at a previous presentation at the Association of Science and Technology Centers. And I'm absolutely delighted to bring her here to contribute to the conversation around gender and technology at Google. The questions around gender and technology shape who we are, how we hire, products that we make, and how we think about the people who use them. So she'll be speaking today on girls, boys, and IT careers. Please give her a welcome, Dr. Cornelia.
Thank you, folks. It's a pleasure to be here. It's gorgeous here. I'm going to report to you on some research that we did starting 20 years ago. And I'm going to just tell you what we found then, and then I'm going to want to have a conversation with you all about whether any of this stuff still holds true, okay? We've been doing it ever since, so it's not all 20 years old. But essentially, I work for a place that's called the Center for Children and Technology, and we were spawned at a school of education, graduate school of education. When the first microcomputers came out, there was a lot of hoopla about how they were going to change everything, how they were going to revolutionize education, how our brains were going to be rewired. And this particular college of education, which was called Bank Street College, that I worked at, decided to take a critical look at all these claims about technology. So at the time, we got a whole lot of donations. IBM, Apple, a lot of people were sending us equipment because we were trying out stuff. And we noticed that our particular center, we were maybe, I forget, 20, 30 people, we were maybe 2/3 women. And we noticed that when the big boxes came in from IBM or from Apple with all the stuff, we noticed that there was an interesting difference in how some of us responded to it. Now, the people who were in charge of our technology were women, so it wasn't about that. But we noticed that when the boxes came in, some people, mostly guys, would like rip them open, would tear into them, would start throwing around stats and talking stuff. And many of us who were equally technologically savvy would sort of sit back and say, when you figured out how this thing works, give me a call and I'll come and play with it, right? So we thought there's something here that we ought to look into, because it was very clear that it was not a matter of knowledge or sophistication about technology, but there was some other kind of attitudinal difference. So we applied for some grants from the Spencer Foundations and others, and we've been doing it ever since, looking more deeply into not so much what gender and technology in the sense of what we know or do with, but more about what we want from and how we feel about and how we relate to technology in some relationship to gender. So the research I want to tell you about is about that, okay? First, however, my postmodern disclaimer, which is that we're not talking about male and female. I have been talking for most of the time about feminine and masculine as the socially constructed notions that have to do with gender rather than about biology, okay? Now, this isn't working too well because people are confusing it again. So I'm proposing that instead of talking about feminine and masculine, we talk about butch femme. All of you know that there's a lot of, in my gay community, there's a lot of femme men and there's a lot of butch women. Some of you know less that there are just as many femme women and butch men in my community. But what we do know in my community is that those concepts, butch and femme, are in no way related to sex. That's where I want to get. We tend to confuse them again, and we tend to talk about them as if all women were feminine and all men were masculine. So I want to just leave those words out, and I just want to talk about butch femme, okay? Does that make sense? So that's what we're with. So femme just means a perspective, a particular way in which we've all been enculturated that is considered feminine by most people. And butch really means a kind of perspective or voice or attitude that is considered or recognized as masculine by most people. And it is without question that there can be as many butch men as women and vice versa, okay? All right. So now, when I go into this stuff, and when I, by mistake, talk about girls and boys and men and women, you know that I'm making a mistake. I don't mean it. I'm old. I forget. But this is what I actually mean, okay? All right. So we did a series of studies. We had, I think it must have been 120, 80, 120, something like that, high technology users at the time. Now I'm talking about the middle to late 80s. People who were really using technology, and we did very extensive interviews with them. At the time, a book had just come out that was called Women's Ways of Knowing. And we sort of used that as a starting point for the kind of in-depth interviews that we conducted. And we did a bunch of other stuff that I'll tell you about. I'm going to give you a nutshell because I want this to be more of a conversation. And I talk fast anyhow, so if I go too fast, just stop me. But we asked our respondents, which ranged from NASA scientists, architects, filmmakers, all kinds of programmers, etc., all kinds of folks. We asked them to tell us the story of their careers. And the first major findings that we had was that it turns out that there is a butch and a femme way of telling the story of your career. Most of the butch way of telling the story of your career is to say, I was in kindergarten when I realized I wanted to be an engineer, and then ever since then I've been making a series of steady linear moves to achieve that goal. I took the right courses, I did all the right things, I had the right hobbies, I did all the right stuff, and here I am today. The femme way of telling an analogous career story could be exactly the same career path is, well, I sort of didn't know what I was going to do, and then there was this person who said, well, maybe you could help out, and then I had a friend over there who needed me to, and then I realized that and I don't know, here I am, I don't quite know how I got here, but I kind of like it, okay? Same career. Now, the implication of that, if you think about it, for young women, is that if you don't sound butch, if you don't sound like you knew in kindergarten that you wanted to be in the IT profession, it must mean that this is not the right place for you. That it takes that kind of mindset in order to find your place in this sort of technological universe. So it's very important to keep in mind that a kind of, I don't quite know, maybe I'm not sure somehow, that way of expressing your desire to work doesn't mean you're not really interested, doesn't mean you're not motivated, doesn't mean you're not going to work hard, and doesn't mean that you're not passionate about what you do. It just means that you have a different relationship to what the career means to you. It's essentially what it boils down to, okay? All right. The other thing we asked folks about in these interviews, which were long, was about what interested them most about technology. And the nutshell version of this is the butch relationship to technology is all about the object, all about the machine, all about the thing, its power, its speed, its capability. The femme relationship to this was very different. It was all about, well, they had the machines, they're useful, but what really matters to me is their function. I look right through the object to its purpose. So I'm much less interested in being femme about this, in the actual machine itself, and much more interested in what it can actually do for me. And that has a whole bunch of implications, for instance, about education. If we educate young people and we glorify the machine, we're going to turn off femme thinkers. We're going to turn off people who want to talk about the social purpose of the thing rather than the thing itself. Then learning about the machine itself, okay, if you have to, that makes sense. But it is not the thing that attracts us, okay? We asked them about mentors and learning experiences, and we discovered, which will come as no surprise, that they were enormously important for everyone. For women and men in our sample, having somebody who said, I think you might like this, I think you're good at this, I believe that you can do this, was enormously important. Women were much, and I mean women now, not femme thinkers, women were much more aware of the kind of help that they got along the way. That's just a matter of sort of gender acculturation, that it is harder in some sense for us, first of all, to claim that we did this on our own, so we're more likely to give somebody else credit for our own achievements, and that it is less likely for a guy to admit that he was helped along the way, okay? Then we asked them this question. We asked them, what is it like to be a man or woman in your profession? When we asked the men, what's it like to be a man in your profession, they went, huh? That was it. End of interview. When we asked the women, what's it like to be a woman in your profession, we usually ran out of tape because they had a lot to say. These were women in very, very high-tech profession, many of them. So there was a whole lot of stuff that I can talk about a little bit. But again, in a nutshell, what we're really talking about is that the experience, at least 20 years ago, was that being a woman in a high-tech profession means that you have to do something which we ended up labeling a kind of compensatory dance, where you have to sort of find a way to fit in, which means you have to leave a lot of the stuff that is really you at home, out of the way. You pre-screen it, you do stuff so to fit into this world, because the world is clearly not designed for someone who thinks and feels the way you do. I don't know if that's still true. You're going to have to tell me. We asked them about the discourse at work. What is it like in your profession? What kind of talk actually goes on? And we found that there was a very powerful difference, that the kind of talk that by and large women like to do combines personal and professional, integrates home life with work life. We like to talk about it all at once, and that most of us feel that in a high-tech profession that is not legitimate discourse. That what we have to learn to do when we work in a place which is largely populated by men and butch thinking, which are not the same, but what we find is that we have to find a different way of talking, and that a major portion of us has to somehow be left out. And we have a desire in some way that is, we found out is quite different, was a major gender difference. We have a desire to integrate the two, whereas a lot of the men we talked to actually said that what they like best is that they don't have to integrate them, that there really is a powerful and to them meaningful and possibly restful separation between all that stuff they have to deal with at home, which includes all that emotional stuff, and the sort of cleaner life at work, where you don't have to deal with that kind of stuff. It wasn't a universal gender difference, but it was very powerful. That it really, the very same thing that made women feel like not quite comfortable because it wasn't quite real, made the men feel like this is good, this is what we want. Another way we saw that was we asked them at some point something about how technology, when they first encountered technology, how they felt about it. And we got these wonderful stories which are exactly parallel, where the guys were talking about, finally, now that I have this powerful piece of technology, I can do all of that stuff on my own. I no longer have to rely on all these people who I used to have to rely on to help me do it. The computer, as it were, lets me do the whole thing by myself. And they loved that, and they thought it was very positive. Whereas women felt afraid that the computer would isolate them and would somehow keep them from having those kinds of collegial relationships. I think all of that is quite different now from the way it was then. This was when the internet was really something that university folks and military folks knew about and nobody else really did. So I'm assuming that there's a change there. But what I really want to tell you about is we did some fantasy work with them. We decided that what we really wanted to do was go below the surface of knowledge and really get at what people's desires were in relation to technology. So we did a bunch of exercises with them. We made a little piece of software because we knew that if you're going to ask people to spit out their fantasies, chances are they'll be a little inhibited if you're sitting there writing it down, right? So we made a little interface at the time, which was very playful, in which we asked them to spit their fantasies directly into the computer, which worked out pretty well because we got some really interesting fantasies. And we essentially asked them for these three kinds of things. We asked them to paint for us in words a formal portrait of them posing with their machine, their work machine, their technology, and then think about it as the way, for instance, an art historian might do 100 years from now, sort of really describing it in structural terms. We also asked them to fantasize about what would be a perfect extension of their current technology, a futuristic machine that would do exactly what they would want it to do. And finally, we actually did an eye movement, we videotaped them. We gave them a very complex looking object, which actually was a Mexican orange peeler, which if you've ever seen one, looks very complicated. And nobody knew what it was, and we told them that they should pretend they were archaeologists in the future and that they had just uncovered this artifact, and they should try to figure out what it might possibly be. And we actually videotaped them and checked out eye movement stuff, exactly how they deconstructed this complex looking mechanical object. From all of this stuff, what we were really looking for, the codes that we used to analyze the data that we got from here, we looked for how people talked about this whole issue of integration, of integrating public and private, work life, home life, etc., integrating technology into life. We looked for what relationship they seemed to see between technology and nature. We looked for a relationship, if we could see one, between technology and the body. And finally, something about technology and creativity and creation. Now, you have to remember, 20 years ago, the creative potential of these technologies were much less obvious than they are now. And finally, we looked at the relationship between technology and communication, which again, at the time, was not an obvious connection. Okay? So that's what we looked for. Now, I'm going to give you a nutshell version of what we found so that we can talk. Here's the Butch version. Okay? Magic wands. If you see a pun there, it's intended. Technology that makes you bionic, allows you to transcend all limitations of time, space, and the body. That is the sort of single most potent or powerful fantasy that we got from Butch thinkers, who, by the way, in this particular study, were really, really largely men. I mean, in most gender studies, you get a serious overlap, so you don't get a completely clear relationship between sex and gender. But we got a very powerful relationship between sex and gender. And that could have shifted by now. But anyhow, so we got a lot of men, but thinking like that. Now here's the other one. Digital amulets, little tiny wearable devices, which at the time was like, portable computers at the time were this big, right? So little tiny digital amulets, small flexible objects that can be worn, that are multifunctional and that allow you to communicate, connect, share ideas. We had one respondent talked about a flute, for instance, a little tiny flute that you could use to make music, but you could also use it to somehow communicate with somebody, or you could use it to share a picture. Cell phones, none of that stuff existed, so the idea that you could have a little tiny object that could do many things, most of them communicative or even creative, was like a really far-out idea. Okay? So that, in a nutshell, was the major, powerful difference that we found. Now, the discourse around technology that we had heard then, and I think we still continue to hear, breaks down in this way, that the sort of Butch discourse is all about stretching the envelope. And it is based on a faith that whatever problems are created by current technology will be solved by the next generation of either that technology or another one. But that it is possible to overcome whatever limitations you see, whether it's in the world or in the technology, through stretching the envelope, pushing further, designing more better stuff. The femme version of this is a kind of more conservative making do, because it is based on a worry that we don't know what the unintended consequences are of dropping a new technology into the natural human social surround. We don't quite know what's going to happen to the fabric of life if we put a new invention in there. And that concern is a very powerful one. You could say, because in the end, women are the ones who have to clean up the mess. Or you could just say that it's sort of built into a different way of thinking, a more holistic way of thinking. For instance, when we did the orange peeler thing, we found that by and large, what the men did with it is they sort of identified parts. And they said, oh, this part sort of looks like a lathe, so this must have this function. And they came awfully close to sort of figuring out what this thing might actually be. We had, by and large, the women who looked at it, didn't do that, looked it all over, and then invented these beautiful narratives about how people might have used this object. But the relationship between the actual structure of the object and this gorgeous story about how it might have been useful wasn't all that clear. Because you really can't quite get there holistically. You really do have to identify pieces to decipher an object like that. But the difference, whether or not they were looking holistically and trying to understand the function of this thing in the world, or whether or not they were looking only at the object and seeing what its function might be, was very powerful. Okay, so this is, in a nutshell, a summary of what we found. Now, every time I show this to anyone, it always sounds like it sounds like propaganda. That's what it sounds like, okay? It sounds like I'm making it up. But this is what we found. We found that in this sort of femme voice, a feminine voice, women talked about, using technology as a medium. The Butch version is to see it as a product. The femme perspective is to see it as a tool. And the Butch perspective is to see it as a weapon. Communication versus control. Creativity, being able to use it to make stuff, versus the power. So, for instance, one of the differences we found was that, I'll give you an example. When I like cappuccinos, and before cappuccino makers were in evidence everywhere, my son, who was then 17, went to Europe for the first time, and he knew I liked cappuccinos. And while he was gone, I bought myself a little milk steamer, which was a beautiful Italian design. And it's this little silver thing. It's gorgeous and has this very curvy, beautiful little spout. And then you hold a little cup underneath it. And if you do everything just right and you don't burn your hand, you get steamed milk. But you have to hold it just right, and cleaning the thing is a bitch because it's curved and little. But it worked. It was beautifully designed. When my son came home from Holland, I think, he brought home a little tiny flat sieve with a handle. What you do is you put a pot on the stove, you put a little milk in it, and you go like this. And it aerates the milk, and you got steamed milk. The difference to me is this gender difference, that it doesn't do the work for you. You still do this with your hand. The tool aids in making the steam, but it doesn't do it for you. That was one of the major gender differences we found, that the butch perspective wants the tool to take over, do all the work. They wanted brain implants that would allow them to blink an eye and mountains would grow. The very same idea, many of the men who actually responded said was also a nightmare. They understood the dangers. It wasn't that they didn't get it, but that's what they really wanted from the technology, to be bionic, to be godlike. The femme perspective is much more tools that are sort of small, helpful. They don't take over, they don't do everything, but they make it a little easier to do what you need to do. And a lot of making do, a lot of figuring out how to use something in another way because it works reasonably well. It may not be the best or most powerful or most efficient way to do it, but it works, so why invent a new thing? Those are very, very different attitudes. So in the end, when we go down to the bottom here, we had a lot of people women talking about how the technology was empowering them. They liked it, but what they meant by empowerment was it enabled them to do more things in a slightly different way, not that they no longer had to do the work. Men talked about transcendence, about the tools themselves, allowing them to transcend all the limitations that were irking them, about having to actually do the work. So that was a very powerful difference. And this is the last one, which I already mentioned, that the fascination that the sort of butch perspective talks about, the fascination with the object itself, with its features, capabilities, with getting your hands on it, with looking inside it, is not shared by femme thinkers who look right through the object. It's transparent to them for its function. That's a very, very different way to approach technology, and it has enormous implications for how we teach kids about technology. Now, I want to get to kids just a little bit. We asked them to fantasize. Yes?
On the list, did you say it's accurate to think of an incrementalist sort of approach on the fem side, evolutionary, they want things that make little changes to empower, as opposed to revolutionary, I want a whole new thing.
That would be a fitting metaphor, yes. I think that's true.
Can you come back to the microphone and repeat the question?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
The difference between a sort of evolutionary perspective where you want little things that make incremental changes as opposed to a revolutionary idea where you build something that completely changes the way you do things and everything, right? That's a reasonable metaphor for this very same thing. All right, so we did this stuff with kids. Kids from ages 8, 9 up to college age. And this is, we asked them to imagine a machine, fantastical machine that they would like to be able to invent. And this is pretty much what we got from a lot of boys. We got some kind of vehicle that would allow them to transcend time and space, and that, when we asked them to draw the inside, would include such things: triangle windshield, moon seats, twin valve, 7-rotor, 9-class, booster rocket, hidden turbojets, and a snack bar. So that's it. That's what we got, a lot of, right? So now here comes the femme version. A little tiny object, little tiny, multifunctional. So for instance, this is a little hard to read. So this very same thing, when the snow comes up, it turns into a shovel so that you can shovel snow. When the leaves fall down, it turns into a rake so you can rake the leaves. Now, you know, if this had been done by a boy, there would not be a rake, there would be a ray gun that would pulverize the leaves, right? Okay. An umbrella that senses when the sun comes out, and then this turns into a cedar, etc. So it's a perfect example of a little tiny multifunctional object that doesn't do the work for you, but that allows you to do the work that needs to be done. Then we asked lately, this must be now 4 or 5 years ago, we went back to a whole bunch of kids and we asked them to draw the internet, which by then had become ubiquitous. This is what we got. The butch version of the internet then, and I don't know if it's so different now. This is hard to see. This is a browser. This shows you all the stuff you can get on the internet, all the information, all the goods. That's what the internet is for them. Now here comes the femme version. Web that connects people so that they communicate and share, right? So we find these differences in kids, and we find that they hold even now when technology has changed, and when in fact technology now really is in many ways the very thing that both the sort of butch and femme thinkers in our sample back then were asking for. You can do all of those things now that they were asking for 20 years ago, right? So what this all means for the real reason I'm talking about all this is the pipeline. There is, as most of you know, a dearth of young women going into these professions, going into technology professions and IT professions. And what I think we have to think about is that most of the time the pipeline really means that you're taking things directly out of boy culture, and that you're promising young people that they will be able to play with that stuff and think like that and play like that in these professions. When we talk about inducting young women into this universe, we tend to talk about finding the kinds of girls who are able to think in butch ways, who are interested in thinking like that, and we want to make it possible for them to feel comfortable and invited into this world. And that's okay, that makes a lot of sense. The missing piece is this, is really inducting femme thinkers into this very same universe. And we were talking about it a little bit at lunch. There are so many IT professional needs now that privilege and require the very feminine kinds of skills and predilections that are traditionally associated with feminine thinking. We need them now, but very, very few young women out there actually understand, or young men who are femme in this way, actually understand that there's room for them in this world. They really don't know that it doesn't mean you have to love to get your hands inside a machine to work at a place like Google. So the missing link, I think, is really recognizing that girl culture, femme culture, also has to be addressed in some way, and that we have to make it clear to young people that you can love Barbie and actually work here. It is possible, because there are things that make you love Barbie that are also called for here. And I think that is a very serious error that we make. Now, I'm not going to go on much longer, but one of the, we've at the center where I work, we do a lot of, we have a lot of projects that are designed to help K-12 school kids think about technology differently, learn with it differently, etc. And a series of different kinds of projects have been based directly on this gender work. The one that we've been working on for a while now, which is directly related to this, is we try to figure out a way, how do we make it possible for young women to understand that what they like to do is necessary in this world. So we sort of divided the IT professions into these 5 layers. Something about networking, about connecting people, letting people talk to each other. Something about writing code, cracking code, understanding secret code language, stuff like that. Something about information or data management, really being able to find things and put things together. Something about web design, being able to make beautiful stuff that other people can read. And something about helping people deal with their equipment. So if we have those sort of 5 layers of the IT professions, we can make inroads. We can show young women that in each one of these layers there's a call for the kind of skills that they actually bring to this kind of stuff. We ended up sort of trying to make 2 kinds of games that are the exactly identical gameplay, but that have a butch femme narrative surround. So this would be the butch surround, right? So that you're using these machines to, there's a guy who has some kind of secret device, which you see there, and you got to track him down and find him, and you got to open up the device and decipher what it is so that he doesn't blow up the whole world or something like this. We did this around 9/11, so we've changed the storyline since then because this won't work anymore. It's too scary now because it's too realistic, right? But something like that would be the butch version, and here's the femme version of the identical game. You have to, the team of people this young woman, this little girl arrives on the island. She's wearing a mysterious device which you have to somehow decipher in order to reunite her with her family. It's exactly the same gameplay, exactly the same stuff. The only difference is that in this case we're featuring the people, and in the other case we were featuring the machines. So it's just a little tiny example of how understanding something about these gender differences can actually inform the way in which you present what you do, what is necessary, and what this universe is actually about. I want to stop because I actually wanted to have more of a conversation. We have done a bunch of other things that may come up that are relevant to this whole issue, but my sort of final parting shot is this. If you want to induct young women into this world, showing them role models that say, yes, women can do it, we're just as good, it's a good idea, but it's not going to do the trick, because what it doesn't do is take into consideration the genuine, valuable worries that we bring. The worries about whether or not the technology will have unintended consequences that will mess up the earth. The worries that something about human interactions is changed in some way that we don't know how to manage. The worry that you won't be able to combine private and public life, social life, and professional life. Those worries are legitimate. The worries that young women were then talking about not being able to talk about personal stuff, those kinds of worries may still be legitimate. I don't know, because I don't work in a place like this anymore. But if we don't address them, if we don't let young women know that it is okay, not only is it okay to worry, but it's actually a good idea that somebody needs to worry. And that if the butch attitude is, yes, we'll make a bigger, better, faster, harder machine that will allow us to do things that we haven't even dreamt of, then the femme version of this, which is like, well, wait a second. Let's just see what might happen and how we can manage or cope with what's going to happen, is also necessary. Otherwise, we have runaway technology, right? So all I'm really saying is that what we need to do is not choose, but is really legitimate that other voice, that femme voice in this world, rather than making young women feel as they do now, by and large. We did the AAUW did a study, the American Association of University Women, did a study not very long ago that we were part of, where young women now talk about, yeah, they could do that, they can do anything, that's true, women can do anything, but I just don't want to. So that attitude, which I think is really about this underlying stuff, is the one we have to deal with. And that attitude requires that we legitimate those worries, that we legitimate that career path, rather than that we leave them with the impression that unless you're a dedicated geek who loves machines, there is no room for you in this world. That's it. Yeah. I have to stay here. So,
me again, and me again later. So a lot of people have identified that the first stage in the pipeline going dry is 5th through 8th grade, when girls sort of drop out of being interested in math, science, etc., for various, usually identified as social reasons.
yes.
And that doesn't seem to me that that's addressed by this notion of the femme side of things, taking more holistic view, the growing changes, or anything that's femme versus butch. So if they dropped out then, what addresses that?
Well, it's a part of it addresses the private public. Oh, I have to repeat the question. Oh, jeez, I'm very bad at this. And there's a mic there, isn't there a mic? It's whether or not, when the pipeline first dries up, which is in middle school, none of that problem is addressed in a certain sense by this business that I was just talking about legitimating a more femme perspective, except that the notion at age 13 that you have to be a dedicated geek in order to fit into this world means at that age that nobody's going to ask you out, you will never have sex as long as you live, right? And that, moreover, that it will somehow transform you into a person who always wears a lab coat and glasses, right? that sort of, no, it's true. That notion that you have to choose between appealing, being a 14-year-old glamour girl, a Barbie, and this world, that it's a completely unrelated set of worlds, is still very much around. And what we have to do to overcome it is to help them recognize that those very same ambitions and goals, wanting to help people, wanting to rescue, etc., that there is room for them in this world, and that you don't have to be a geek in order to be meaningfully employed in this universe. And they don't know that.
Well, I guess my puzzle with that is that we'll shift it a little level. At that point, it doesn't seem to me that the choice is between being Barbie and joining this world. The choice is between being Barbie and being Barbie that happens to enjoy math and science.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, about Barbie. Okay. Math and science and technology education, by and large, does not address the femme way of thinking. It, by and large, presents the subject matter in a butch fashion. It, by and large, especially technology education, we teach, no, girls don't take programming courses. Because we did a little project in which we made a little flash application in which what you have to do is put together an ice skating routine. You have a little game, and there's a little ice skater, and you have to put together an ice skating routine. You have like 10 different steps that you can put together. And if you do it, and you ask, for instance, to make an elegant figure 8, the steps don't quite do the trick. You have to do something to change them. Now, girls bring with them, as do boys, a lot of prior knowledge about ice skating, what with the Olympics and everything. So the whole enterprise makes sense to them, why you would have to change things. Slowly, as you begin to realize that the steps you have available don't quite do it, you have to start to think about variables and what you might have to change to make it possible to make a figure 8. And after you've done that and it still doesn't quite work, you unpeel it even more and you actually look at the code and you actually change some of the JavaScript underlying it. That process, which starts from a meaningful enterprise that makes sense, a function, and then slowly you learn to look at what you need to do in order to make that work even better, that makes sense. So we had 6th graders up through 10th graders learning the kind of programming concepts that are tested on the AP tests in high school. But it's because we turned that whole thing on its head. Instead of teaching them about code and giving them the building blocks that eventually lead to something meaningful, we started out with something meaningful, a function that makes sense, and then slowly allowed them to investigate just what they needed in order to be able to do that. That's a very different approach to teaching programming. That's what we need to do more of in order to invite the 14-year-olds to take the programming class. Same is true in science. Same is true in math. That the whole enterprise has to somehow be meaningful, rather than that you learn a lot of stuff which you're told someday will be meaningful.
Maggie, can I try? Is this working? Is this working? No, it's not working? Oh,
you want me to?
So this does go to the video. Okay.
So I should wear this instead of this one?
Oh, you have that one?
I got one on.
You got one on? All right, great. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was trying to get the audience and give you some more freedom.
Oh, okay. Right.
So does the mic, that one works. So if you want to ask questions a little bit towards the back, we can do that.
The story we tell girls, but that we also need to change the values of the IT culture as well. Because I sort of feel like some of the values aren't quite, you ask whether it's still like this, and I sort of feel like some of the values aren't quite there yet with the fem side.
You're asking me whether or not what I'm saying is that we have to change the story we tell young women or the values that are actually sort of inherent in this world. Changing the values is not an enterprise that I know anything much about. But I'm assuming that a place like Google, which is clearly deeply invested in somehow living up to its values, is a place where you could fruitfully think about what does it mean to really make people feel welcome. So you guys would be at the front lines of figuring that one out. The other one is the story. How do we tell the story? So if each one of you were interviewed and you were to tell the story of how you ended up here, what would this story look like? And if every story sounds like a butch story, you know, by age 10 I knew, it would be discouraging. If some of your stories men and women, sounded like, I really had no idea what I was going to do, and I sort of like didn't find my passion until I was like, and then I got this job, and then I realized, oh, this is cool. If some of the stories sounded like that, it would be very encouraging. Most of the role models we parade in front of young women don't admit this degree of ambivalence and uncertainty. Most of them sound, even if they are women, as if they were born to do this. And that, I think, means that we do young people, young men and young women, a disservice, because we don't sort of own up to the fact that many of us discover that we like working in this kind of environment rather than we knew it going in. Most of us do. All right.
I'm involved in middle school Lego robotics, and everything from your sort of inventory of suggests to me that it would be a long road to hoe to get that fuel on the thin side.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Wait, say that again. I couldn't hear it.
Oh, sorry. So, given this inventory, and if I think about, well, I'll just go into middle school and give an elective on Lego robotics. That to me seems it's not going to have the kind of appeal to the STEM side, because it's all about controlling stuff.
Well, okay, so here's my Lego story, which I already sort of told at lunch. When they first did Lego Logo at MIT, and they tried it out with kids, you could build a vehicle and it could follow paths and see sensors, etc. And the boys thought it was great. The girls thought it was kind of boring, because who wants to just build a vehicle that can follow a path? What they wanted was Legos that could interact with each other. Eventually, based on that research, they built the second version of this, where the bricks actually have some intelligence built in, and you can indeed make things that relate to each other. It was a more sophisticated technology, but they did it. And those kinds of Lego bricks that you can now do things with are more attractive to girls than the original ones were. So it's not robotics itself. If it's all about a robot being able to do something, it's interesting. But if you look at this sort of, the IBO soccer league and all that kind of stuff, where you have robots interacting with each other, that's interesting. If you are allowed to anthropomorphize a little bit, it's even more interesting. In other words, if the metaphors that you are allowed to use to understand what the robots do, the metaphors are allowed to be anthropomorphizing. You are allowed to talk about feelings and moods and things like that, rather than being told that that's illegitimate, but sports metaphors are legitimate. That's another way of legitimating it. So that whole the way we started this whole research is that many, many years ago, remember, when you wanted to get the computer to do something, you could do one of two things. You could issue a command, or you could pick something from a menu. Issuing a command is a butch thing to do, scares the bejesus out of some of us, because we have visions of armies dying. Picking something from a menu, hey, you picked the wrong thing, you pick another one, right? Big deal. That's a femme way of thinking about the same thing. Some of it is in the metaphors we use, some of it is in the language, and some of it is just in the narrative that we spin around doing this stuff. So robotics has to have more of a narrative than just, I can get a machine to do something. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that he gets up there and says, we have Legos and we want to play with them. I mean, it doesn't even start with that. So the narrative starts out with, like, let's take some Legos.
Yes.
That's sort of unappealing already.
Yes, it is unappealing already. Yes.
I was wondering if you're familiar with Wired magazine. They do a regular feature called Japanese Schoolgirl Watch.
I should know that.
And it's usually just a little quarter of a page in a giant magazine, but they will highlight the new fun technology, and it is sort of a girl thing because it's often about communicating with people. And I'm wondering why we don't have more of that in U.S. society.
Good question. I don't know, but that would be a very good idea. Because we know, I mean, the research that we do know is that girls are using technology every bit as much as boys do. They use it to communicate, they do a lot of texting, they do a lot of talking to each other. So cool technologies is now a concept that works for girls. It didn't used to work for girls 20 years ago. The words cool technology, by definition, meant a butch thing. So I, for instance, I'm a gadget queen. I love gadgets. But the idea that you could be a gadget queen didn't make all that much sense. Now it makes a lot of sense. So cool technology by now is meaningful, and it usually is the kind of technology that allows us to connect, to communicate, to share ideas, and to do all of those femmy things. Yes, I wish we had more.
I had another question. I noticed that in the drawing where you did separate the IT into those categories, that support was represented at the bottom, which is actually the way I see it in a hierarchy of things, which not as a bias, but that's the way, that's the general value put on it in an organization, and yet that is probably where we the highest proportion of women.
Yes.
Which I find upsetting.
Yes. And that was not accidental. That entire hierarchy was not accidental. Because it isn't, because it's true that, I mean, there are very few young women who find themselves deeply interested in the notion of what we now call networking, even though the idea of networking makes a lot of femme sense, right? But that's not what we think about when we listen to the guys who we have to talk to when the thing is down again and we can't communicate, right? So translating that into something else would be very interesting, but it is true that that hierarchy is the more techie, the more esoteric techie from our perspective, the higher up in the hierarchy. And the people who actually deal with people are on the bottom.
I have to say, it's one thing I find really interesting about the networking. You were saying when you have to deal with somebody, like telling you about your networking, it's very frustrating because, well, I do networking, and no, I have to deal with my home ISP all the time, right? And whenever I'm on the phone saying this is broken, like they're always mad talking to me, and it seems like they're trying to confuse me. Like they're trying to pretend that because I'm a woman, I have no idea what's going on, and if they use a really long word, I'll shut up and listen to the big voice.
Right, yes.
Yeah. So another question I have is, what do you think, you're talking about also just like lower levels of education, like high school, middle school. What do you think about higher education? Because when I was in college, I had the thought of, well, maybe I would want to do computer science, like for a major, but in college, if you didn't start out your very first semester of your freshman year, it was like, there was no way you could do it. You were an outcast. How dare you want to do computer science?
And if you didn't take any kick-ass math courses, you're lost too, right?
Yeah, so you actually have to start in like middle schools when they started having multiple tracks of math. So you have to, it's almost like you have to know then. But
That is the impression we leave young women with, and we know it's not really true. Carnegie Mellon did a whole thing, and I gather Lenore Bloom was here talking.
Carnegie Mellon, and they were awful about that.
They were awful about it then. When was it a while ago?
99.
Well, they say now that they have changed around their recruitment policies and their whole program to be more inviting to young women, and Lenore Bloom says that as a result of that, they're getting what they consider a better class of male programmers as well, because it is a more holistic or a different approach to programming. I can't vouch for the fact that that's true, that's what she says, but at least theoretically it makes a lot of sense that if you make the thing more inviting to young women who may not have been thinking since middle school that they want to do this, that you get a more interesting, more creative mix of people, and at least that's what they claim has happened.
I guess two questions. One is, you seem to have a lot of focus on communication as expressing one of the femme interests. And I don't know, for me at least, it's much more usability. You know, what can I do with this? Why is it important? It's not that when I talk to the world, I mean, they can all go away most of the time. It's making something that's actually useful. I mean, I was going to be a chemist. I could just yes, but you know, passes in the air. Who cares if it all goes away? No one. It doesn't matter. It's not useful. And so that might be a piece
Absolutely.
to focus on.
That is the femme thing that I meant by we look right through the object to its function. That we really want to see what makes it useful, and that's what matters more than whether it's the most efficient or most powerful way to do it.
Yeah, but I just want part of it is there's introverts, there's extroverts, they're femme introverts. They don't necessarily want to talk to people. They still want to solve problems. being in a environment where you're told either you must be butch and go off and care just about the technology, or you have to talk to everyone all the time. I'm an extrovert, and the idea of talking to everyone all the time is appalling. So having things that work towards that. The other piece I wanted to comment on is you're putting support as the only sort of interacting with people, or one of the primary interacting with people. I think in the classification you're missing the whole set of product requirements,
yes.
user, definition
Yes.
of what functionality is supposed to be, getting groups to talk together, understanding how to phrase what the APIs are. There's a whole lot of teamwork and management stuff that has to go on. We need to understand the technology, and if people don't know what that is, they're not going to realize that whole job set exists, and then you get, the current sort of scenarios.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we should include that. I think you're absolutely right. I also want to say that at least in my community, we know that every single human individual has a complex mix of butch and femme characteristics so that we don't end up with stereotypes. So you don't have to be a butch who's always butch or a femme who's always femme, right? That's very important. But I think you're absolutely right about the other stuff. And the support category does need to be widened to include the very kind of stuff you're talking about. Absolutely.
The other piece about those aren't low status jobs.
No.
And that's important too.
That's important. Absolutely. Right.
I'm currently involved with this middle school teaching program, and we will be bring middle school kids to learn this talking about. And we have like 4 or 5 different teams, each doing, or each bunch of Googlers teaching separate different things, right? So one of the teams is like computer music, like making their own CD and recording their own lyrics. And the other ones are more like like robotics, like Glenn spoke about like Python programming and building the server. So when we were splitting up teams, dividing like girls and boys, it wasn't the criteria wasn't that it's a girl, so she should go into the music team and not in the building the server team. Just like when you come to Google, I don't think that's the criteria. You just assign. But now like we did 6 weeks through the program, and I feel like the girls who are in the music team are having much more fun because they can express themselves more. I think there's more fun touch to it. Then the girls in say like building the server thing. Obviously the boys are having more fun in that team. So, but that's what the reality is, right? Because if you chose computer science and you end up being a computer engineer, that's what you're going to do. So should we feel bad, or should like things change around for the girls in those teams, or how do you change things? Or do you have to do anything special just because they're girls and they have to do?
There are many different ways of thinking about that, okay? One of them is that you shouldn't have to do anything special, that it's okay for only some girls to be interested in that and to go that way, as long as you also legitimate, as the previous young woman just said, those other kinds of jobs. The other way to think about it is that if you really think hard about what you do in the cell group, it's conceivable that the boys are creating an atmosphere that is more butch than it needs to be. It's very often the case that you can femme things up if you just think about it a little bit harder, okay? You can also butch things up if you think a little bit harder. But butching things up almost comes with the territory of having guys in there because they're so determined not to be considered femme. It's still such anathema to be considered femme if you're a guy that they're very determined to show whatever butch thing could be happening there. So it requires usually a sort of extra effort to femme things up, which usually means legitimating certain other ways of thinking about things, certain other interests. It usually doesn't mean changing the whole program. It just means being a model for that way of thinking as well as for the actual work. But there's no simple answer to that.
So having say like for the building team, if we had a women mentor instead of the mentor, would that help?
If the woman mentor is willing to be somewhat femme about it, yes. It can be a male who is willing to be femme about it. I don't think the sex is nearly as important as the attitude.
So in the 10, 12 years I've been in the computer industry, what I've seen is more a broadening of the types of roles to be played in an IT company than I've seen, I guess, people with sort of femme persuasions taking butch roles. That doesn't happen very much. And I'm wondering if there are some roles that they're a lost cause to try to make them not appeal, or to make them appeal to somebody with sort of the opposite mind. And if maybe what you're saying and what's really possible is to sort of broaden the roles and redefine the roles and make a little bit more flexibility for the company as a whole, where rather than spending a lot of time trying to convince people with fem minds to be data center engineers, for instance.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the missing piece, however, is that, as is historically always the case, if you have a lot of women doing something, it tends to be undervalued. So the other part of that is to also make sure that you highly value and legitimate those other more femme kinds of jobs. And we very often neglect that part. So, there's the old story about how in Russia, in the Soviet Union, medicine became a less valued profession because a whole bunch of women went into it, right? So that is always a danger, and you always have to look for that. But I think it's absolutely true that there are certain kinds of jobs that require a butch attitude and a butch set of predilections and interests. And then if you find women with that set of interests, great. If you don't, forget it. But we tend to value those professions far more than we do the other ones, which are more like social work. And that's the part we can change.
So I want to thank everybody for coming here. I want to actually just ask Cornelia one last question to sort of wrap up. I wanted to ask if you had any sort of specific thoughts or suggestions about Google's approach to recruiting and hiring and interviewing. I know that you don't know all the details, but maybe you have some suggestions for us that can sort of take into account some of the things that you suggested today.
I don't actually know anything whatsoever about this, so of course I will now continue to answer the question, which is that I think Google, because what you do is what the general public knows you do, okay, is that you make it possible for people to find out stuff. Essentially, that's what the public knows you do, right? That's femme. That's okay. That's interesting. It's useful. There's nothing wrong with it, right? The fact that there's computers and equipment and machines and stuff involved, but that's okay, that's necessary. I think as a place, as a profession, it's very different from a company where people expect that you spend all day in a lab, like making chips. It's very hard to interest young women in making chips. But Google is a different place. So if you have a recruitment policy that says we help the world deal with all kinds of important issues because we help people find stuff out that they need to know, I don't think it's a hard sell. Then you have to make sure that they understand what the different, so what you were saying about really understanding all the different roles that are necessary to make this thing that most of us just know as a site that you go to find shit out, right? That's the part that's missing. So if you do that, if you go into high schools and middle schools and it's clear to young women that there are all these interesting jobs that you can do that support that enterprise, I think you would get young women interested. Then you have to make sure that when you interview them, you don't listen for the butch passion. If you're listening for the butch passion, I want to work, you're not going to hear it. Or you're going to find only those young women who have that. If you listen for different ways of sort of talking about the same kind of stuff, but that has never really been connected with technology in the same way before, you may find that there are certain kinds of talents that you're particularly interested in, but that have never been expressed in relation to technology before. That's the best I can do with that question.
Thank you very much.